President heading the Center for Technology and Society at ADL. And I am so excited to welcome Donny O'Sullivan to join me today in conversation. So, at its core, the Center for Technology and Society's mission is to end the proliferation of anti-Semitism and all forms of hate and harassment online. It's no small task. And part of why I'm so excited to have Donny here today is in his work as a CNN correspondent, he really does groundbreaking investigative journalism on the real-world effects of online misinformation. Donny's done a lot of work looking at specifically conspiracy theories, how they take online, how they translate to offline, how these narratives take hold, and how they spread. So I want to just start by grounding this conversation a little bit in the stark reality of where we are today. We already know, we've been here talking about the rise of anti-Semitism right here in the United States. But we know that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories spreading online have a real-world effect and spawn violent behavior offline. You can just look at Pittsburgh to Poway to Buffalo. All three of those mass shooters had been exposed to anti-Semitic conspiracy rhetoric online before engaging in that activity offline. Now, in our Center for Tech and Society, we also do an annual survey of how users experience hate and harassment online. And I just want to say the numbers are not encouraging and getting worse. We know at ADL that hate and harassment and anti-Semitism being normalized online, making users' everyday experience online really problematic. It doesn't only ostracize the people most at risk, but it also is a dangerous situation where we can find ourselves marching towards violence in the real world. And yes, I believe the online world is the real world now. So, in addition to all of this unsettling reality, we now have the proliferation of artificial intelligence tools that are becoming more and more accessible to everybody, including things like ChatGPT, deepfakes, synthetic media, and the world is only now beginning to truly grapple with what that might mean for the proliferation of hate, harassment, and extremism. And so that's why I'm invited Donny here today to help us unpack some of these issues, make sense of some of them, and think about the direction that this all might be headed, and also to talk a bit about what some of the things we can do about it. So please help me welcome Donny. All right, so let's dive in. In a lot of your reporting, which I've watched over the years, you really do get into these conspiracy theories, not just online, which you do great work in, but you also talk to people in the so-called real world who have fallen for these types of theories. So I'd love to just hear a little bit about what you're seeing. How do these narratives latch on? How do they manifest online before we get into the what happens once they skip from online to offline?
Yeah, I think, one thing that we underestimate sometimes when we talk about people who get sucked down rabbit holes, conspiracy theories and whatnot, is the role of community. The community plays in it. I've spoken to, QAnoners, I've spoken to anti-vax moms, and when you really get, to the heart of an issue, they talk a lot about how, they had maybe gone through a trauma or felt alone or were looking for answers. And they find these answers oftentimes through conspiracy theories online because, conspiracy theories can offer nice little answers, easy answers to hard questions. Yep. And it can give people a sense that they understand something or they get something. So that's kind of, over time, just from speaking to people, that's what we've seen. But it manifests, of course, in all different ways. People, it can be on TikTok, it could be at Facebook, the Facebook groups, of course. And what we've seen, particularly since after January 6th, when, a lot of major players in this space got deplatformed, people are now going to the other kind of alternative platforms, the smaller platforms, where there is very little moderation at all.
And how have you seen some of these actual narratives evolve in recent years, from maybe the pre-January 6th world to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, 2020 was kind of, I guess, a kind of watershed moment if we think about conspiracy theories, and that, particularly with the lockdowns and whatnot, people spent so much time alone. So much time in front of their screens, computer screens, mobile phones, looking for answers, again, at a time of quite angst. So, you think about that year, we saw what played out here on January 6th. Between that, the distrust of, the vaccine, medicine, and then, of course, distrust in democracy, that's just continuing to evolve. And, it's from speaking to a lot of people who believe the election was stolen. That's, a lot of folks genuinely believe that. And they genuinely believe it because some of their political leaders are telling them that too. But they're seeing evidence, quote unquote, every day, out of context, of course, false, that gives them this perception that, yes, indeed, we don't have a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of evidence, as you point out, a common phrase online is do your own research.
Yes.
And people will say that and you'll think, hey, that sounds like, that's not a bad piece of advice. Do your own research. Before, social media might have meant go to your local library and really dig in and look at different sources. And now, today, do your own research has actually been co-opted as a talking point to sow doubt in anything that you might be learning from actual experts or reliable sources, whatever you might consider reliable sources these days. So how do you think about that? When we say do your own research, I mean, you work for CNN, you work for a news organization that has to fact check things and has a process. But now anybody can find anything they want online. How do you think about that? Do your own research, find your own narrative.
I mean, it points to so much about what's the biggest challenges I think we have in society today, right? I spoke recently to a mother who, her 40-something-year-old son is very far down the rabbit hole. And, she would talk about how she would try to help him in the past where, because of course things get cherry-picked. And so sometimes he would bring her these conspiracies, some of them were anti-Semitic, some of them were anti-government, and she'd try help him and say, well, look, here's actually the full context of what we're looking at. And then, but the challenge, of course, with social media and the fact that this ecosystem of conspiracy theories is now so big is that that the conspiracy theorists can always find another piece of evidence to say, well, what about this? And then what about this? And what about this? And of course, distrust in media, in experts, in institutions, just compounds this issue. That is one thing, and I think we kind of saw that around the election too, right? Because there's so many videos that have been taken out of context, of course, of election officials who are just doing their jobs, but people watching the videos and saying, oh, there's ballots there, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is there's so much of it. There's a tidal wave of misinformation, and I've spoken to people, and I've to believers of some of this stuff, and I'll talk them through why what's being said about maybe one video is false, but then they'll say, okay, well, what about this one, and then this one, and this one, and it's never ending. There's just so much, you throw enough at the wall, something's going to stick.
I mean, actually gets to the point of one of the reasons we're trying so hard in Center for Technology and Society to look at the larger systemic issues and what are some of the ground rules and policies around this, because if you're just trying to take down content of everything that is not accurate, that is an uphill battle that you're never going to win. I do want to talk a bit about sort of the mainstream platforms versus fringe platforms. And one of the things we focus on at CTS is how do you push the most extreme voices back to the fringes And that used to feel like a logical path, but now, as our colleagues in Center on Extremism will tell you, the amount of terrible things happening on the fringe platforms just migrates back to mainstream eventually. I'd love to hear the interplay between, is there such a thing as, don't worry about that, it's just a fringe platform, they're all just talking to each other, or do you see this starting to interplay with the mainstream?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think for years, and we spoke a lot about how, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and the TikToks of, what were they doing, what content, there was a lot of discussion about, well, why do you have this hateful figure on your platform? Why do you allow this person post X, Y, and Z? Platforms took a lot of action all at once after January 6th. They kicked off some really prominent hate figures and conspiracy theorists. But I mean, that is not really, that's not a long-term solution, I think, for society, because what we've seen is these people have, we call them fringe or alternative platforms, but there's millions of Americans using them, tens of millions of people around the world. You can go onto Telegram and there's groups devoted to the likes of QAnon and other kind of violent conspiracy theories, and there's hundreds of thousands of members, So in some ways, and look, I mean, I don't have the right answers for this. I don't have the answers. I just cover it. But fortunately, what is the right approach in terms of you deplatform, and so you deplatform prominent figures. Their followers then move on to these fringe platforms, and that can just then drag those followers down further and further and further into more hateful and violent rhetoric. So I don't have the solutions.
I'm not going to say I have all the perfect solutions myself either, but we did actually put out a study with one of our Balfour Fellows recently about the effects of deplatforming. And while, again, as I mentioned, we are looking for more holistic solutions to really try to create a healthier online ecosystem, we have found that deplatforming the most problematic figures, while it does move some people back to the fringe, it also it makes them lose their way of being able to monetize their content. Because what a lot of people don't realize, a lot of the loudest voices dragging people down some of these hateful so-called rabbit holes, they're doing it because they're able to build their audience, they're able to monetize, they're able to profit off it. So deplatforming in and of itself of major figures actually does have some positive effect in that respect. But we don't have the perfect solutions. We're working on it as well at CTS.
Yeah, in some ways I think, it's almost the genie's out of the bottle now, in that, particularly there was some very blatant kind of QAnon type figures, people who were spouting just absolute BS, really in the lead up to the election, and they had hundreds of thousands of followers. And I think, kind of looking back now, I think even people in the platforms would say, yes, that might have been a bit of malpractice on our part, that we didn't do more to crack down on this, because what you had was these people who came to notoriety, infamy, whatever you want to call it, and that's where they started their build-up. That's where they got their first core following, and as you say, a lot of people followed them to the other platforms.
I will absolutely say, as someone who worked at Facebook for a while, I fundamentally believe that allowing the loudest, most prominent voices, there seems to be sometimes special treatment for those with the bigger platform, because the company themselves make money off of those with the biggest platform. And I'm glad that some people realize post-January 6th that that's not a best practice, but that is one of the things we are pushing for. To not treat someone just because they have the biggest platform with white gloves, that in fact they can be more dangerous by inspiring more people. So before we get into the scariest part, which is ChatGPT,
it's all been so uplifting.
Yeah, it's been very uplifting. I have one question before we get into the scarier future ahead, and this might give tips to some people in the room as well. How do you at CNN think about some of the things you're reporting on? Are you giving more oxygen to a hateful actor? Or if you're retweeting or quote tweeting or amplifying a message that actually at its core is about hate and harassment and extremism? How do you think about, as a reporter, how to handle some of that content.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the issue we run into every single day. It's kind of, being a journalist on this beat is a bit different in that oftentimes you're actually saying, okay, this is a story we shouldn't do because it might be a good story, might be interesting, but we have to consider the size of our platform. Look, it's always a judgment call. I don't think we always get it right, and I think we've been learning a lot. I will say, QAnon, for instance. I had been following its evolution for years, but I don't think mentioned it in a story until about 2020. Because I was, and my editors, we were kind of in the mindset that we would be giving this a global platform, et cetera, et cetera. But then, of course, we saw then in the final months of 2020 and going 21 how it did actually materialize into a real movement. So I would even say that I was probably too cautious in not talking about it earlier and covering it and shining a light on it that way. But it's really difficult, because ultimately, no matter what you do, you're going to be playing into the conspiracy theorists' hands. But I think we take the view that we have to cover these things. We have to show, and that's why so much of the reporting we do is trying to focus on the victims, on the families, the families of who have loved ones who get sucked down these rabbit holes, and really trying to get, we talk a lot about the responsibility of the social media platforms, but back to the point that I made at the top of this was, one thing that has just struck me time and time again is this idea of community, and that of course is obviously a much bigger issue to deal with in society. But people don't get out as much as they did right before. They're spending more time alone on their phone. Bowling alone, the book 20 years old this year, I think. That kind of phenomena. And you really can't underestimate how I've been covering a group for a while who they believe that JFK is still alive. He's not, but it's a bizarre, silly conspiracy theory. But actually, then once you scratch under it, there's anti-Semitic undertones, there's a bloodline, etc., etc. That in itself is a crazy belief. But you want to see how great a time this community of believers are having.
Yeah.
They meet up, they go to events, they think they're in the know about something that everybody else doesn't understand. Their families don't get it finally that they've found this group that they're all on the same page. So I think that's really the issue. If you want to start tackling this, it's about, well, how do we, give people a different, an alternative form of community?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what drew me into this. Yes, applause for that. Part of what drew me into this work to begin with was, I used to work overseas, embedded in communities that were really susceptible to extremist messaging. And it was always the same thing. It was people were looking for a way to belong to something. Mm-hmm. And so any intervention that we might have on social media has to have this whole of society approach. But now, if we haven't scared you all enough yet, let's talk about what's coming next. We've all heard so much news about ChatGPT and deep fakes. Actually, Doni, you even came when I was teaching at Cornell Tech, and you spoke to my students and showed how much work goes into dissecting a video before you use it to prove that the video itself is real. Mm-hmm. So we, as a society, are just starting to grapple with, listen, artificial intelligence tools could also be used for positive interventions, right? Like maybe there's a way that artificial tools can actually truly find anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and hate and extremists online in a more effective way. But I guess my question to you is, how are you thinking about this next wave of tools and what it might mean for these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all saw, I think it was just before the holidays when ChatGPT really kicked off and I think scared a lot of us. But the developments we've seen, it's incredible just how quickly, whether it's creating fake audio, fake video, fake images, and tools like ChatGPT, there's particularly with the image generation, somebody when Trump was brought in New York and arraigned, someone in real time was, I think everybody was waiting for the official images. A photographer had been let in for a few minutes. But in that meantime, as people were waiting for images to emerge, people were using these new AI tools to, imagine what was happening in the courtroom. And kind of putting Trump in, showed him fighting and this sort of stuff. But it was incredibly real looking.
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of, I think, the fact that you can create this stuff really easily, really quickly. I think as a newsroom, we're trying to, get ahead of that and to be proactive in how do we think about vetting this sort of thing. And it's of course something that we're hopefully going to try and stay ahead of. And then, of course, I think, with fake audio as well. I mean, I did a story where I tortured my poor parents and called them using my AI audio voice. My dad fell for it, my mom not so much.
You can watch it. It's a good story.
But, you think about like the degree to which an audio tape has played a role, in election campaigns, the Access Hollywood tape, for instance. How easy now it would be to, one, manufacture a fake tape, but two, the fact that this technology now exists gives people the opportunity to a plausible deniability, right? To say, well, actually, I didn't say that, that's AI, that's a deep fake. So
the library's dividend is real and
exactly.
comes faster and faster. I'm so sad that we don't have much more time here, but that is part of why what we do at CTS is also to try to work with some of these companies as early on as possible to help them understand how these tools can be manipulated in all of these terrible ways. I wish we had more time to unpack it all. I hope we scared everyone in the audience enough with this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So tonight we had the privilege of celebrating Israel and the occasion of its 75 years of independence as a Jewish and democratic state. The story of Israel, as we know, is one of many colors, is one of ongoing conflicts and challenges, but also of overcoming the odds, of inspiration, innovation, creativity, and great accomplishments. As an Israeli citizen, as a former Israeli ambassador, and as a mom of two young Israelis with a lot of chutzpah, I share the deep concern that many of you have here and many in the Israeli society have of what is happening today in Israel. But I remind myself on a daily basis the miracle of our young state and of the fact that we do not have another homeland. Tonight, we have the opportunity to look back on Israel's short yet remarkable history, consider Israel's present situation, and look into our crystal ball and share our expectations, our hopes, and our fears of what is expected in Israel's future. For this conversation, I'm so privileged to be joined by two individuals who have dedicated their professional lives to Israel and to the Jewish community. Dr. Michal Bitton is a sociologist, a spiritual entrepreneur, and as Rosh Kehillah, community leader of the Downtown Minyan in New York City, and scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute. She's committed to building vibrant and welcoming traditional Jewish life. A researcher of Sephardic Jewry, Michal earned her doctorate from New York University, where she is now directing the first national study of Sephardic Jews in the United States. Thank you, Michal, for being here. And Dr. Michael Koplow is the Chief Policy Officer of Israel Policy Forum, and also serves as a Senior Research Fellow of the Kogot Research Center at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Before coming to Israel Policy Forum, he was the founding program director of Israel Institute. He holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University, where he specialized in political development and ideology and the politics of Middle Eastern states. Welcome, Michael. So they cut our time of the panel. I see how it's, from 30 to 25 to 20 minutes, so let's rush right into the first question. Throughout Israel's short history, there have been several moments that have come to define the country and what it is today. As we look back at the past 75 years, is there a particular moment that for you personally encapsulates Israel and its history? Michael, let's start with you.
So thank you, Marina, and thank you to ADL for having me here tonight. So for me, the microphone not working? Right. So for me, the moment that encapsulates Israel's history in a way that I find very meaningful, and particularly in terms of looking ahead, is November 1977, when Anwar Sadat came to Jerusalem and addressed the Knesset. And for Israel and for Israelis, this was an important thing. It demonstrated that after 3 decades of nearly nonstop war and nonstop fighting, Israel was not necessarily destined to live by the sword forever. It demonstrated that Israel could be integrated into its region. It could be accepted, something that Israel and Israelis were desperately seeking ever since the founding of the state. It demonstrated that Israel could hold out its hand to other countries for peace, and that hand could be accepted. And 1977 is also important because it introduced a number of concepts that we are still grappling with today. The peace treaty with Egypt wasn't just about a peace treaty with Egypt. It also incorporated the idea that there should be peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And so this is something that we are still obviously grappling with today. There are still questions today about what it means to be at peace. The peace with Egypt is still a relatively cold peace in contrast to what we've seen recently with the Abraham Accords, which is much more of a societal peace, a people-to-people peace. And so that too is another question we're grappling with today. What does it look like to actually have peace, and what are some of the trade-offs that have to happen? And this concept of land for peace, something that today for many Israelis is controversial. Many Israelis look at this idea of land for peace and they look at Oslo and they think that it has failed. But in many ways, the foundation of peace between Israel and its neighbors, as encapsulated in the Israel-Egyptian peace treaty, which came out of this visit in 1977, is based on this formula. And this, too, is a question that Israel is grappling with today. So I think it's a wonderful moment in Israeli history, showed the best of Israel, showed, I think, the future that Israel could have, but also introduced a number of questions that Israel is still dealing with today and will be dealing with, I think, into the future.
Michal, what's your moment?
So, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. What a pleasure to celebrate Israel's 75th birthday. 1977 was also the year in which an Israeli prime minister from the right was elected for the first time, Menachem Begin. And I want to tell you about a moment, a speech that Menachem Begin gave in 1981 in what is now known as Rabin Square in Tel Aviv, a speech that is not well known but really, really important. Begin was running for re-election. And the night before this speech, in June 27th, 1981, the opposition, led by a young Shimon Peres, also had a rally in this Rabin Square. And a comedian called Dudu Topaz, have you heard of Dudu Topaz? He got up on this stage and he started making the case to thousands of people as to why they should vote for Shimon Peres. And he also made a lot of fun of Menachem Begin. And the main source of humor that he found was actually to make fun of Begin's Mizrahi supporters. He called them chachchachim, which was a derogatory term to talk about the lower class, Middle Eastern and North African Jews who he said were the base of the Likud. And he said, us here in this square, we are the Israel Yafa, the beautiful Israel, the elite secular Ashkenazi camp that he was leading. The next night, Begin gets up on stage. You can find this on YouTube. The speech is magnificent. And he repeats Dudu Topaz's words. And he says, what Dudu Topaz just did is a desecration of God's name. There should be no division between Mizrahim, Ashkenazim, we're all siblings. And he said that he was proud to have Mizrahim, he used the term chachchachim, to have them in his camp. 2 days later, Menachem Begin won re-election. Now, I'm sharing this not to make any political point about the right or the left in Israel of 1981 or 2023. I'm sharing this because this one speech reveals to us really difficult truths that we have to remember, especially now on Israel's 75th birthday. We have to remember that at the creation of any state, no matter how magnificent, how miraculous, like you said, at the beginning of any state, any enterprise, there are always some people who are left behind. We have to remember this speech because we have to remember that Israel is right now still a country that is not only at war with external factors, right, with external enemies, but that actually is made up of internal contradictions, of competing dreams that are going on right now. Is Israel secular Tel Aviv, sacred Jerusalem? Is it East? Is it West? Mizrahi, Ashkenazi? There are all these contradictions that are going on there. And if we're going to celebrate the birthday right now, we're going to look back at the last 75 years, plan for the next 75 more, and even more, God willing, and ask ourselves, what is our responsibility right now to continue the work of repair, to make sure that we bring back into the shared story those who were left behind, and ask ourselves, where can we find strength from these competing narratives to build a stronger and more flourishing Israel?
So let me continue. Continue your thought to today's most hot topic in Israel, right? The judicial reform. So in the Israeli newspaper, The Marker, they had a special issue for Yom HaAtzmaut a few days ago, and the headline said, and I quote, "Israel is celebrating 75 while she's torn and bleeding more than ever before. But the gift she has received for its birthday could save her from herself." End of quote. So while many claim that this is the end of Israel as we know it today, and we're going down the cliff, others see it as an opportunity to actually bridge the gaps in Israeli society and perhaps create a new national ethos. So how do you see this playing on? We're for we're for gender equity, Michael. So we'll give you the right to start.
So, to me, what has taken place over the past few months in Israel is indeed an enormous crisis. I think it's the biggest crisis Israel has faced in its history. It's, of course, not a military crisis, but it is a crisis not just about Israeli society, but about the nature of the Israeli state, what state institutions will look like, things that should have been worked out at the very beginning of the state and were not. And so I don't downplay at all the severity of what we're seeing inside of Israel. I think that there is a version of how this ends where Israelis can come together, where the different sides of the political spectrum can come together, can agree on what the principles of judicial overhaul should look like. That effort is, of course, underway right now under the auspices of President Bougie Herzog. I'll say that I'm not terribly optimistic that the two sides are going to come to a compromise, and the question is then, what happens next? And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu certainly has calculations to make. They're not easy ones. I think that whatever direction he goes in, he's going to find himself in a tough political spot. But I think the way to think about this, with all respect to my Israeli friends and colleagues who are in the streets and talking about Israeli dictatorship, I don't think that that's how this ends, irrespective of what happens with the judicial overhaul. I think Israelis are fighting about two different visions of democracy. I will be open and say that one of these visions of democracy appeals to me more. It's a vision of democracy where you have a strong system of checks and balances. It's a system of democracy where you have strong guarantees of minority rights. It's a system of democracy where everything is in balance and there is general compromise. But there's another outcome for this, which is that Israel will continue to be democratic. It will continue to have free and fair elections. And once those elections happen, governments will do as they please, and the check on them will be the people. It will be the next election. And that is certainly a form of democracy. And so I don't downplay the crisis that we are seeing, but I also think it's important to make sure we understand what's involved. It really is two different visions of democracy. And I also think it's different visions of what we mean for a Jewish state. Israel will remain a Jewish state. The question is it going to be a Jewish state primarily for Jewish citizens of Israel? Or is it going to be a Jewish state that Jews from around the world, and certainly we're sitting here in the United States, certainly a state where North American Jews can feel not only that they are welcome and that they're embraced, but that their Jewish values are ones that play out in the state of Israel. So this certainly is a big moment. There are questions about democracy and Israel as Jewish, but I think that it's important to frame it in a way that really takes into account everything happening in this moment and what may happen down the road.
I'll just add, the rabbis in the Talmud said that at the end of the beginning of the Second Temple, prophecy ended. So there is no prophecy. Israel will become what its people and its supporters lead it to be. And I think we have to remind ourselves that we have the moral responsibility and agency to face what you just said, Michael, is one of the biggest crises that we have faced. And that if we really, I believe that if we work together, diaspora Jews, Jews in Israel, those who believe, especially in the vision of liberal democracy that I think you mentioned right now, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic seeing the resurgence of civic society in Israel, people who are going into the streets, who are raising up really difficult questions that remain dormant for decades, that are critical to be reckoned with in order for us to move forward. And I believe that if we all continue to insist that, the desert might take 40 years, right, for us to cross, but if we continue to work together and move forward, that we'll come closer to the promised land.
So you mentioned the diaspora Jews, and I hear that question over and over again here in the States and from other Jewish communities around the world. What is the role of diaspora Jews today? And does the current government of Israel care what the Jews abroad think?
After that?
Go ahead.
Role of diaspora is so easy. Listen, I think there's so much here. I was just rereading, I was reading a biography of Ben Gurion going through 1948. Israel wouldn't exist today without the philanthropic and other type of support of Jews around the world who were there to support Israel. Now, to me, this doesn't mean that those who vote in Israeli elections and who pay taxes and who send their kids to the IDF, that those of us who care and see ourselves as stakeholders in Israel, but don't do those same things, that we have the same level of having a say in the things that happen in that, within Israel. And honestly, by the way, if we really wanted to change certain trends in Israel, if all of us here in this room and other places would move to Israel, that would be the most effective way, let's be honest, to make, but we also are needed here. Okay, the most effective way to make a change. But listen, I think I view myself personally as having a relationship with Israel that is unconditional. Unconditional doesn't mean uncritical. I view myself as really thinking of as a stakeholder in the magnificent project that is Israel, which has repercussions for Jews around the world. So I think all of us need to continue working and especially partnering with Israeli Jews on the ground who see what's around them, who understand Israel from the inside, don't always have the American lenses superimposed upon reality, and to partner and to support and to help as much as possible from here.
Michael?
So Michal said that prophecy ended thousands of years ago, and perhaps it did, perhaps it didn't. But I think that we as North American Jews actually have an important role to play when it comes to Israel, and that is to be prophets. In Jewish tradition, the prophetic tradition, the prophets are the ones who try to be the moral center, who try to push the people forward, try to uphold a certain set of standards, even if those standards may be unrealistic, even if those standards may be unachievable. Israeli Jews and Israeli non-Jews have a very difficult time. They live in a rough part of the world, and they have to make choices and compromises, and we all here as Zionists, we're aware of what those choices and compromises are. I think that our role as American Jews is to support our Israeli friends and relatives and colleagues, but I also think that we need to serve as prophets. We need to set forth a vision of Zionism that may be a more aspirational one. In some sense, we have it easy. We don't have to live with the responsibility that Israelis have to live with, because we are not faced with the reckoning of some of the choices that we may want them to make. But the fact that we don't have that responsibility and that we don't have to live with the consequences also provides us an opportunity. It provides us an opportunity to set forth a vision and hope that Israel can start to move toward that vision, understanding that it will be difficult, understanding that Israelis have a much more challenging set of circumstances than we do in many ways. And so I think we can keep holding Israel to this prophetic vision and understand that Israel may fall short, but that we ourselves shouldn't drop that vision for Israel, because I think both us and Israelis ultimately want to see the most perfect, the most expansive vision of Zionism that we can have.
Thank you, Michael. So we only have a few minutes left, so I'll jump right to the last question. And for us to end on a very positive note, what gives you hope as you look into the next 75 years and beyond of the State of Israel? Michael, go ahead.
So there are a few things that give me hope. One thing that gives me hope is something that we are seeing take place in Israel right now, which is hundreds of thousands of Israelis, if not millions of Israelis, who care about their future on both sides, on the right and the left, the religious and the secular, those who are in favor of judicial overhaul and those who are opposed to judicial overhaul. They're making their voices heard. They're out in the streets. They are taking their democracy seriously. They're taking their civil society seriously. And we should all be zocha. We should all be privileged to live in a place where people care about their futures so intently that they are willing to show up in the hundreds of thousands at the drop of a hat to stand up for their principles and stand up for what they believe in. And the other thing that gives me hope is that with all of the challenges Israel faces, we are sitting here in the American Jewish community, and this is an overwhelmingly Zionist community, not only in this room. For all the challenges between Israel and the diaspora, this relationship remains strong, and I think it will remain strong for another 75 years at least. And so I am strengthened myself by the fact that this Israeli diaspora partnership, which, as Michal said, was so integral in the early years of the state to the establishment of Israel, remains strong and will continue to remain strong.
I was speaking with an American Christian friend of mine talking about Israel, and I told him that in my biggest nightmares, I think about a civil war, okay, happening in Israel. And he got really upset with me. It's like, don't say the word civil war. I'm like, why? He said, well, you know, I know a lot of people in the far right in America who are they're the ones talking about civil war. But in the American context, they're advocating for it. And they're talking about how good it would be to actually break up. And I told him, well, you know, in the Israeli context, there's so many people right now who are talking about civil war, but they're talking about it from a place of concern and a place of saying we have to be able to build bridges and we have to be able to work towards a vision of a common good. So I've been in the presence of so many courageous people who are combining fighting for their principles and their commitments. They're not neutral on the sidelines. And at the same time, they're insisting that we have to be able to have an expansive sense of we and have to be able to build bridges in different parts of Israeli society and really strengthen the social fabric of the state of Israel. So.
Thank you, Michal. So I'll just mention that, of course, ADL is doing exactly that in Israel. And when I was asked by one of the leaders here present and a good friend, what can I do to support Israel today? So I told him, you're already doing it because you're supporting ADL, who's first defending Israel here in the US and around the world, and also working very hard in Israel to create those bridges and bring together the different parts of the Israeli society. Thank you both so much for being here.
I just want to thank Jonathan Greenblatt and thank you to the ADL for the invitation to speak with you. The ADL's papers in the American Jewish Historical Society in New York were a boon to my book. And the ADL has more collections in its possession that I don't think have ever been seen by the public. Whatever they hold, those archives matter. They could be a gold mine. And I hope that they will be preserved and made accessible to researchers, because the collections will shed light on the ADL's history so that more Americans and actually future ADL leaders can learn it, and learn it with the kind of complexity and depth that it deserves and that it has not yet received, bringing the ADL's legacy alive to more Americans. Let me discuss the ADL's interest in the John Birch Society. A small band of anti-New Deal businessmen established the Birch Society in 1958. Robert Welch, founder, and the others were rich, white, and almost uniformly Christian. The founders combined mainstream associations with beliefs widely seen as fringe. 3 of them had served as president of the National Association of Manufacturers. And one of the men was Milwaukee Sentinel's Man of the Year in 1953 and led the YMCA. At the same time, their views occupied a spot on the edge of the political spectrum. They regarded the growth of government in the first half of the 20th century, U.S. participation in World Wars I and II, and the unrelenting expansion of welfare programs as steps toward living under communist rule. Despite their wealth and status as colossi bestriding the world's most dynamic economy, the men shared a rage at what they considered a string of failures and deceptions that had brought the United States to its knees. They had a simple-sounding goal. Their plan was to teach the masses about the internal communist threat to the United States. By the mid-1960s, the group had recruited some 60 to 100,000 upwardly mobile, white, Christian, often suburban men and women to join local 20-person chapters in their communities. Birchers held many beliefs. I'll sum up just a few of them. They rejected virtually the entire post-World War II U.S.-led international order, urged the United States to get out of the United Nations, and warned of the greatest threat to the U.S., political, media, and other elites. One Birch leader told a rally in 1974 that the nation's establishment had imposed, quote, planned shortages of consumer goods on the country and had to be brought to justice. Quote, we're going to take Nixon and Kissinger, McGovern, Fulbright, politicians of that sort, and we're going to try them for treason, and they'll be hanged, he said. Newsmen, take that message and publicize it. The message they'll get is, the Americans are coming. And about 400 Birchers gave him a standing ovation. Birchers filtered a conspiratorial brand of single-minded anti-communism through the perceived needs of their towns and suburbs. More than mainstream conservatives, Birchers trafficked in conspiracy theories. Fluoride in the drinking water, one Bircher document warned, was, quote, a massive wedge for socialized medicine. Finally, Birchers defined freedom on their own terms. It was not access to the ballot box for all, nor was it freedom to act in accord with one's own precepts, and it certainly was not the freedom from want. Their conception of the Republic demanded the dismantling of the welfare state and dreamed of imposing their own version of Christian values on American schools and culture. Critics argued that Birch ideas fostered bigotry and that the society was a safe harbor for racists and anti-Semites. But Birch leaders insisted that members had to pass a kind of test to demonstrate their, quote, good character and religious ideals. They denied that prejudice had any part in their movement. Public Relations Director Tom Davis said charges of anti-Semitism were, quote, the worst kind of defamation. Robert Welch blasted accusations of racism as vicious nonsense. ADL's leaders viewed such denials with a healthy dose of skepticism. The Holocaust was fresh in their minds, and they had had firsthand brushes with Nazism. In 1934, future ADL National Director Benjamin Epstein was studying history in Berlin when he saw firsthand how Hitler seized power. In 1938, future ADL General Counsel Arnold Forster recruited pro bono lawyers to help the ADL combat Nazi plots against America. In 1941, the ADL's future director of fact-finding and public relations in New England, a man named Isidore Zak, became a counter-espionage expert for the U.S. Army. And during the war, Zak led a team of undercover operatives on a hunt for fascist spies in the northeastern United States. Post-war, ADL's leaders made it their mission to expose what they considered, quote, a vast enterprise of hate operating in the United States, and called on the ADL to find, quote, ammunition for the war to make our land a more perfect democracy, as National Chairman Meyer Steinbrink urged. In February 1959, just 2 months after the Birch Society was founded, Isidore Zak learned that an activist he was monitoring was opening his homes to meetings of a new group. Zak, again the director of fact-finding for the ADL, wanted to find out more. The ADL was probably the first organization to track the Birchers, and its anti-Birch campaign ultimately became the most effective of all of them. Zak's agents had code names. They set out on missions to find any shred of anti-Semitic, racist, violent, or totalitarian evidence on the part of Birchers. Operatives obtained chapter membership lists, ran credit reports on Birchers, ferreted out their employment records, wrote down their license plate numbers, and even obtained a codicil to one Birch donor's will. Some of the scariest or most unflattering bits ended up in the press. The ADL's campaign, sometimes called Birch Watchers, unearthed numerous examples of Birchers' anti-Semitism, racism, and even admiration for Nazis. An ADL spy infiltrated a Birch front group in Connecticut and reported that he overheard Birchers singing the praises of Adolf Hitler. ADL's Pennsylvania director discovered that a Bircher, a likely Bircher named John Noble, was giving speeches to Birch audiences featuring a conspiracy theories that bones found at Buchenwald came from American soldiers killed by communists and not from Jewish victims of the Nazi death camps. The ADL apparently apprised the FBI that Noble was, quote, inciting racial turmoil. The ADL also exposed anti-Semitism at the very top of the Birch movement. The Anti-Defamation League revealed how Birch founder and University of Illinois classics professor Ravillo Oliver was giving talks in front of hundreds of Birchers about what he termed, quote, a conspiracy of the Jews. Oliver claimed that Israel had exported LSD to sow chaos on college campuses in the United States. The ADL program revealed the society's violent-tinged rhetoric and the possibility that its members would carry out attacks against minority groups. Two agents, codenamed Ben Brith, a play on B'nai B'rith, were troubled by what they described as, quote, John Birch Society involvement in the purchase of weapons and infiltration of gun clubs. Another ADL monitor reported that when civil rights picketers showed up at a pro-Birch rally attended by thousands of people, the crowd's mood turned sour and ugly. The ADL agent quoted one attendee saying, quote, give me a machine gun and I'll mow those bastards down. The Bircher propensity to brand critics as traitors to the United States and to lash opponents with dehumanizing rhetoric also caught the ADL's attention. When an ADL agent codenamed Boss 7, Boston number 7, attended a Birch speech, a drunk stockbroker who was a member of the society yelled, commie sympathizer, anytime, quote, someone in the audience made a statement that was anti-John Birch, and the ADL was concerned about a potential escalation to violence. The ADL understood how Bircher's conspiracy theories evoked long-standing anti-Semitic canards, that sinister forces, code for Jews, controlled the money supply, the news media, and the global order. They documented how white supremacists saw the society as an ally and linked arms with Birchers to promote massive resistance to civil rights. The ADL chronicled much of this in its newsletters, press releases, and books. and its program applied economic pressure on some individuals affiliated with the society. The famous Los Angeles haberdasher, James Oviatt, who was a Bircher, sent some 3,000 customers an anti-Semitic tract called Common Sense, based on the notorious protocols of the learned elders of Zion. Oviatt refused to renounce the mailing, so the ADL issued a press release criticizing his anti-Semitic activities. Oviatt sued the ADL for libel. In his lawsuit, however, he complained that, quote, the Jewish press and, quote, an international secret Jewish fraternal society had conspired to harass a patriot and damage his business, thus proving essentially the ADL's original charge. The ADL was deft in the way it used the press like an athlete jawboning a referee. The ADL's information was often a crucial addition to media stories about the Birchers. After one newspaper in Orange County, California, used ADL research in an article critical of a Society National spokeswoman who was spreading conspiracy theories, ADL leader named Harvey Schechter called the paper's editor a good friend of ADL. The Society understood that the ADL posed a significant threat to its reputation, and the ADL rankled Birchers to no end. The Society's national spokesman, John Rousselot, said of the ADL, quote, they are on our backs all the time. A different Birch leader charged that the ADL was, quote, a Hitler agency. The ADL was not the only organization keeping tabs on the Society. The Anti-Defamation League was part of an informal anti-extremist coalition in the 1960s that included the White House, the NAACP, the union-backed Group Research Incorporated, and other individuals and organizations tracking the far right. But the ADL stood at the apex of this coalition, and it probably did more than any organization to expose the Society's dark side to the world. The Birch Watchers ginned up negative press and made the Society toxic in the eyes of many Americans. They neutered the ability of violent, conspiratorial, white supremacist elements to win elective office or dominate either party. And Birchers were forced to spend time, energy, and resources fending off the ADL's charges. The incessant public conversation about Birchers as a hate-filled group generated the impression that the organization must be tainted and ought to be shunned. The ADL's program triumphed. By the 1970s, the Birch Society had become a shadow of its old self. Now, I argue that Birch ideas lived on, but the organization shriveled. It had money woes, it had lost members, and it had lured more and more violent, bigoted individuals to its ranks, sowing internal strife. Yet few factors were as significant in the wilting of the Birch Society as the ADL's campaign to expose its hostility to democracy, tolerance, and pluralism. Had the ADL's documents not been available in the archives, it would have been impossible for me to tell this story. Ultimately, it's a tale of the ADL living up to President John F. Kennedy's praise for the Anti-Defamation League, for its, quote, distinguished contribution to the enrichment of America's democratic legacy and its tireless pursuit of equality of treatment for all Americans. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.